It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the air carried a faint chill, but the sun still shone bright enough to warm your skin. A convoy of motorcycles roared down a quiet stretch of highway, their engines growling like a pack of wild beasts. The riders, clad in leather jackets adorned with intimidating patches, were the type of group that turned heads wherever they went. They weren't just out for a leisurely ride. Their presence had a purpose, and the weight of that purpose hung heavy in the air. At the head of the group was Vince, a towering figure with a grizzled beard and piercing eyes. He was the leader of this notorious biker gang, a man known for his no-nonsense attitude and a quick temper. His voice carried over the thunder of the engines as he signaled his crew to pull over at a roadside diner. The parking lot filled with the sounds of screeching tires and heavy boots hitting the pavement. They weren't here for the burgers or coffee. They were here for information. Inside the diner, the atmosphere shifted as soon as the bikers entered. Conversations hushed, forks paused midair, and a nervous waitress fumbled with a pot of coffee. Vince stepped up to the counter and leaned in close to the startled cashier, his voice low but firm. "We heard there's someone in town. Someone we need to have a little chat with." The cashier stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "You mean him?" Outside, a lone figure stood by a black SUV parked a few feet away from the diner. He was tall and composed, his posture exuding an air of calm confidence. Dressed in a simple navy suit, he didn't look like the kind of man who'd be the subject of a biker gang's interest. But there was something about his presence that felt unshakable, almost unnervingly steady. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the diner, and then returned to what he was doing, unloading what appeared to be a set of gym bags from the back of the vehicle. Vince and his crew watched him through the diner's large glass window. "That's him," Vince muttered, his jaw tightening. "Donald J. Trump, the man who thinks he's untouchable." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gang. They'd heard stories about him: business mogul, former president, media powerhouse. But today, he was just a man who had crossed their path. And Vince didn't take kindly to anyone stepping on what he considered his turf. As the gang exited the diner, their boots crunching against the gravel, the tension in the air thickened. Trump turned to face them, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't even seem surprised. Instead, he stood his ground, his hands resting calmly by his sides. Vince took a step forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've been making a lot of noise lately, Trump, thinking you're above it all. But here's the thing, you're on our road now, and we don't take kindly to uninvited guests." Trump tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He said nothing, letting the silence speak for itself. The bikers exchanged glances, their bravado momentarily faltering under the weight of his steady gaze. Vince took another step forward, his hand hovering near the chain clipped to his belt. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue." And then, in a voice calm and measured, Trump finally spoke. "It's not that, Vince," he said, addressing the biker by name as if they were old acquaintances. "I'm just wondering if you've thought this through. You see, I've picked up a few skills over the years, and let's just say, I'm not as defenseless as you might think." The gang laughed, the sound echoing off the nearby hills. Vince smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Oh yeah, and what are you gonna do, Mr. Big Shot? Talk us to death?" Trump's smile widened, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. "Not quite," he replied, reaching for one of the gym bags he'd unloaded. He unzipped it slowly, deliberately, revealing a neatly folded Corette guy and a black belt embroidered with golden lettering. The bikers stopped laughing. Vince's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "You see," Trump continued, his voice steady as he removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "I've always believed in being prepared. So if you really want to have this chat, I suggest you take your best shot, because you might just learn something they don't teach in biker bars." The air was electric, the kind of silence that came before a storm. Vince clenched his fists, his pride warring with a knot of doubt growing in his stomach. The rest of the gang shifted uncomfortably, their bravado cracking under the weight of the unexpected revelation. And then, without warning, Trump stepped forward, his stance fluid and controlled, the movements of someone who had spent years honing his craft. The bikers froze, their tough exteriors suddenly seeming paper-thin in the face of this unanticipated challenge. The moment hung in the balance, the outcome uncertain, as the tension reached a breaking point. What happened next would be the talk of the town for years to come, a story too unbelievable to forget. But for now, all anyone could do was wait, eyes locked on the man who had just turned the tables with nothing more than a quiet confidence and a well-timed revelation. The parking lot was silent except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Vince's eyes narrowed, scanning Trump as if searching for some crack in his calm exterior. The black belt in Trump's hands seemed to hold more weight than the entire gang's collective swagger. It wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was a statement, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. Vince took a step back, his bravado momentarily shaken, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "You've got jokes, I'll give you that," Vince said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But wearing a belt doesn't make you a fighter. It's what you do with it that counts." Trump didn't respond right away. He took his time, carefully folding his suit jacket and placing it on the hood of his car. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as if every action was part of a larger plan. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady, unhurried. "You're right, Vince. It's not about the belt. It's about discipline, control, and knowing when to fight, and when not to." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't the response they'd expected. They'd come looking for a confrontation, a chance to flex their dominance, but now they found themselves caught in an unfamiliar game, one they weren't sure they could win. Vince's second in command, a wiry man named Razor, stepped forward. His nickname came from the long, jagged scar that ran across his cheek, a souvenir from a bar fight years ago. Razor wasn't as imposing as Vince, but he was known for his sharp wit and quick reflexes. He pointed a gloved finger at Trump, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Discipline, huh? Is that what you're calling this little show? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're stalling." Trump's gaze shifted to Razor, his expression unchanging. "Stalling? No, I'm giving you all a chance to think this through. Violence isn't the solution you're looking for, but if you insist, I won't hold back." The tension in the air was palpable. Vince clenched his fists, the veins in his neck visible as he fought to maintain his composure. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd expected Trump to fold under the pressure, to try and talk his way out or call for help. Instead, Trump stood there, calm and unmoving, as if he already knew how this would end. Inside the diner, the staff and a handful of customers watched nervously from behind the safety of the glass. The waitress, a young woman named Lisa, clutched a coffee pot so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is bad," she whispered to the cook, an older man named Hank who had seen his fair share of trouble over the years. "They're going to tear him apart." Hank shook his head, his eyes fixed on Trump. "Don't be so sure, kid. There's something different about him. I can't put my finger on it, but he's not scared. That's not something you see every day." Back in the parking lot, the bikers began to circle Trump, their boots crunching against the gravel in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Vince cracked his knuckles, his voice low and menacing. "You talk a big game, Trump, but let's see if you can back it up." Trump took a deep breath, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Vince, let me ask you something. What do you think this will accomplish? You've got your crew, your reputation, but is this really worth it? Picking a fight with someone who doesn't want one?" Vince's jaw tightened. "It's not about what you want. It's about respect. You don't just show up here and act like you own the place." Trump tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Respect isn't something you can take, Vince. It's earned. And if you think intimidating people is the way to get it, you've already lost." The words hit harder than any punch could have. Vince's face flushed with anger, his pride stinging under the weight of Trump's calm rebuttal. He took a step closer, towering over Trump, his fists clenched and ready. "Enough talk," he growled. "Let's settle this." But before he could make a move, Trump raised a hand, his voice firm but not aggressive. Wait, the command was so unexpected, so authoritative, that even Vince hesitated. The rest of the gang froze, their movements halted as they watched Trump with a mix of curiosity and unease. "If you really want to fight," Trump said, his tone measured, "then we'll fight. But on one condition." Vince scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Oh, you think you're in a position to make demands?" Trump met his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't a demand. It's an offer. You and me, one-on-one. No weapons, no backup. Just us. If I win, you walk away and leave me alone. If you win—" He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Well, we'll cross that bridge if we get to it." The gang erupted into laughter, the sound echoing through the parking lot like a storm. Razor slapped Vince on the back, grinning from ear to ear. "You hear that, boss? He thinks he can take you." But Vince didn't laugh. He studied Trump carefully, his mind racing as he weighed his options. On one hand, this was a chance to assert his dominance, to prove once and for all that he was in charge. On the other hand, there was something unsettling about Trump's calm demeanor, something that hinted at a strength Vince couldn't quite place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Vince nodded. "All right, Trump, you've got yourself a deal. But don't say I didn't warn you." Trump gave a small nod in return, his expression unreadable. He removed his tie and rolled up his sleeves, his movements slow and deliberate. The bikers formed a loose circle around them, their faces alight with anticipation. The stage was set, the stakes higher than ever, and the air crackled with unspoken tension. Lisa watched from the diner, her heart pounding in her chest. "This is insane," she muttered, her eyes darting between Trump and Vince. "He doesn't stand a chance." Hank crossed his arms, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Don't be so sure, kid," he said again, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I've got a feeling this is going to be a fight they'll never forget." The crowd held its breath as Vince and Trump squared off, the parking lot transformed into an impromptu arena. Neither man moved, their eyes locked in an unspoken challenge. And then, in a heartbeat, the stillness shattered as Vince lunged forward, his fists swinging in a wide arc. What happened next would leave everyone, biker and bystander alike, questioning everything they thought they knew. Vince's fist cut through the air with incredible speed, aiming straight for Trump's jaw. The crowd of bikers leaned forward, their eyes wide with anticipation, waiting to see their leader land the first blow. But Trump didn't flinch. He didn't even move an inch. Instead, as Vince's punch closed in, Trump shifted his weight, stepping to the side with a fluid motion that seemed almost effortless. The punch flew past him, missing by mere inches, and Vince stumbled slightly, off balance for just a split second. The gang froze. Vince's face twisted in surprise, his pride wounded more than anything else. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered, let alone by someone who didn't even look like a fighter. He quickly regained his stance, growling under his breath as he turned to face Trump, his fists now raised in a more defensive posture. Trump stood tall, his hands still relaxed by his sides, his expression calm and collected. He didn't seem to be in any hurry, and his eyes never wavered from Vince's, as if daring him to try again. "That's a good start, Vince," Trump said, his voice measured, but with an underlying confidence that sent a chill through the group. "But you'll need more than that to land a hit." The bikers shifted uneasily, the atmosphere charged with tension. They were used to seeing their leader dominate his opponents, whether in a fistfight or a war of words. But now, for the first time in a long while, they weren't sure what would happen next. Vince, sensing the unease creeping through his crew, took a deep breath and steadied himself. He launched another attack, this time faster, with more force. His movements were sharp, his eyes narrowing in on his target. But again, Trump didn't move the way Vince expected. Instead of stepping aside, Trump raised his arm in a quick, calculated motion. His hand caught Vince's wrist in midair, stopping the punch dead in its tracks. Vince's eyes widened in disbelief as Trump, with a smooth twist of his wrist, sent him stumbling backward, his feet sliding across the gravel. The bikers' hushed whispers filled the air, their disbelief palpable. Razor's eyes darted back and forth, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The tough guy, the leader, the one who always had the upper hand, was now standing in the dirt, struggling to regain his footing. Vince's anger flared. He pushed himself back to his feet, glaring at Trump with newfound intensity. "You're good," he spat, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "I'll give you that, but I'm not backing down." Trump, still calm, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, as though he'd just walked through a light breeze, rather than narrowly dodging a punch. "I never expected you to," he said, his voice even. "But this isn't about backing down. It's about understanding when to fight and when to walk away." Vince's grip tightened on his leather jacket, his fists still trembling with adrenaline. The pride of a biker gang leader ran deep, and no amount of strategy or martial arts skill was going to make him back down now. He was about to charge again when Razor stepped forward, placing a hand on Vince's shoulder. "Boss, hold on a minute," Razor said, his voice low but urgent. "Something's off. Look at him. Look at his eyes. This guy isn't just some businessman playing dress-up. He's trained. He knows what he's doing." Vince shot Razor a sharp look, annoyed at being questioned. But the doubt in his second-in-command's voice didn't go unnoticed. Trump wasn't just some clueless rich guy. He was a force to be reckoned with. And that realization was slowly sinking in for everyone around him. Trump, sensing the shift, gave a small nod. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to offer you something better than whatever this is," he said, his tone growing softer, though still firm. "You've got a reputation, Vince. But what happens when that reputation doesn't mean anything anymore? When you pick a fight with the wrong person?" Vince's lips curled into a snarl. "You think you're the wrong person?" Trump didn't flinch. "I don't think I'm anything. But if you want to keep fighting, I'll keep going. But it's not going to end the way you think." The words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken tension between them. Vince's mind raced, the wheels turning as he considered his options. Trump wasn't just some blowhard making empty threats. The man's calm demeanor, the way he had evaded every attack, the way he seemed to know exactly what was coming, there was something unsettling about it. Something that didn't add up. "What do you want from us, Trump?" Razor asked, his voice cautious, now fully aware that the situation had escalated far beyond what they'd expected. Trump glanced over at Razor, then back at Vince. "It's not about what I want," he said, his gaze piercing. "It's about what you want. You've been running things your way for a long time. But what happens when things change? When someone doesn't follow the same rules?" Vince bristled at the implication. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? This is our territory, our rules. You don't get to dictate anything." Trump took a step forward, his presence radiating an intensity that made the gang shrink back just a little. "No one owns anything, Vince. Not really. We all just borrow it for a while. And eventually, the time comes when it all slips away." His voice was low but unwavering, his words carrying the weight of someone who had lived through battles, both physical and strategic, and emerged on the other side stronger for it. There was a silence that followed, thick and suffocating. The gang exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond. They were tough, they had fought their way to the top. But here, in this moment, they were facing a man who had been places they couldn't even imagine. A man who had seen things they would never experience in their wildest dreams. And for the first time in a long while, Vince and his crew felt the creeping sensation of doubt. "You've got a choice," Trump said, breaking the silence. "You can keep going down this road, keep fighting and threatening, but eventually the road ends. Or you can step back and think about what really matters. Because I promise you, it's not this. It's never been this." The words hung in the air like a challenge. But it wasn't a challenge of fists or motorcycles. It was a challenge to their very way of life. And for Vince, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The bikers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had come looking for a fight, but they hadn't prepared for this. This slow, calculated war of words that seemed to cut deeper than any knife or punch ever could. What would they do next? Would they finally understand the true nature of the challenge they were facing? Or would they dive deeper into their old ways, unwilling to acknowledge the shifting tides? The answer, as always, would lie in the choices they made in the moments that followed. The air was thick with uncertainty, a tension so heavy that it felt as though the entire parking lot was holding its breath. Vince stood frozen, his fists still clenched at his sides, his mind racing to process the weight of Trump's words. The rest of the gang seemed just as uneasy, the earlier confidence now replaced by doubt. Razor's expression was hard to read, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here, something deeper than just a fight between bikers and some out-of-place businessmen. Trump stood still, his posture unbroken, his eyes steady. There was no arrogance in his stance, no sign of superiority. It was a calm confidence that seemed almost effortless, and it was beginning to unsettle Vince more than anything. The man was, without a doubt, in control of the situation, and Vince couldn't quite figure out how that was possible. "Vince, think about it." Razor spoke up, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "This isn't like the usual crowd we mess with. This guy, he's something else. He's not scared. He's not like us." Vince shot him a glare, but his mind was already starting to swirl with the same unsettling thoughts. What if Razor was right? What if this wasn't just some rich guy trying to play tough? What if Trump was more than he appeared? The image of Trump standing there, unmoving, while Vince had thrown everything he had at him, gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. "Shut it, Razor," Vince growled, his voice laced with frustration. But there was no real conviction behind the words. "This is our turf. We don't back down. Not for anyone." Razor hesitated, casting a sideways glance at the rest of the gang. They all stood in silence, watching, waiting for their leader to give the word, to end the tension one way or another. But Vince didn't know what to do next. His gut was telling him that this wasn't going to be like the other fights, like the ones where the winner was determined by sheer force. This one was different. "Listen," Trump's voice broke through the thick silence. "I didn't want things to go this way. I didn't want a fight. He took a step forward, his hands still open at his sides, his voice steady, yet tinged with an almost sorrowful edge. "But you're all just following orders, aren't you? No real reason for this. You're fighting because it's what you've always done. What happens when that stops being enough?" The question hit Vince like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the weight behind them. Trump was offering something more than just a fight. He was offering a challenge to everything Vince had built, everything his crew stood for. A world where power wasn't just about muscle or reputation. A world where the rules weren't written in blood, but in something else entirely. "Enough of this," Vince barked, his voice laced with growing anger. "You don't get to come in here and question us. You think you're better than us." Trump didn't flinch. "No, I think you're better than this. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. You've already earned the respect, haven't you?" His words weren't a boast. They weren't an attempt to provoke. They were simply a statement, one that seemed to weigh heavily on the gang. The implications were undeniable. If what Trump said was true, then maybe, just maybe, all this violence, all the constant fighting was a charade. A never-ending cycle of proving themselves to the wrong people in the wrong ways. Vince's mind raced. He wanted to lash out, to crush Trump's calm demeanor with a blow so hard that it would put an end to this uncertainty. But even as he thought it, something tugged at the back of his mind, a quiet voice telling him to stop, to think for a moment longer. Across the parking lot, Lisa watched the scene unfold through the diner's window. She had been working here for years, and in all that time, she had seen plenty of confrontations, but nothing like this. She could feel the tension in her chest, the unease creeping up her spine. It wasn't just the bikers or even Trump that scared her. It was the shift in the air. Something was changing, something that couldn't be undone. Hank, the cook, stood beside her, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "This ain't gonna end the way they think," he muttered, his voice low but steady. "Trump's not like the rest of 'em. I've seen it before." Lisa glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean? He's just a guy, isn't he? A businessman." Hank shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on Trump. "No, kid. That's not what I'm talking about. This man's been places, done things. He's not scared of them. Not scared of anyone." Lisa didn't understand. But then again, maybe she didn't need to. She had seen plenty of tough guys in her life, and they all had one thing in common. Eventually, they broke. They all cracked. But Trump, he didn't seem to be following that same pattern. Back outside, the bikers were beginning to feel the weight of the moment. Razor, his hands stuffed in his pockets, was the first to break the silence. "Vince, this is getting out of hand. We came here to take charge, but I don't know, man. This feels different. Maybe we should back off." Vince turned sharply to Razor, his eyes flashing with irritation. "You want to back down? You're telling me you want to just walk away from this?" Razor's eyes met Vince's, but there was no defiance in them, just a quiet, unnerving uncertainty. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time we ask ourselves if this is what we really want. Do we need to keep doing this? This whole thing, is it worth it?" Vince's gaze softened just for a moment. He wasn't used to hearing his second-in-command question their way of life, especially not in front of the rest of the crew. But the doubt was there, growing like a seed, and the more he tried to push it away, the more it seemed to take root. Trump, sensing the shift, took another step forward, his presence calming, yet powerful. "It's not too late to change your path, Vince. You don't have to keep fighting. You don't have to keep being the person they expect you to be. You can choose." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as the gang watched in stunned silence. It was the first time in a long while that any of them had heard someone offer them a way out, a chance to step off the path they had been on for so long. But Vince wasn't sure he was ready to take that step. Not yet. The anger inside him still burned bright, and the idea of walking away from everything he had built, everything he had fought for, felt impossible. Still, a seed of doubt remained, growing in the back of his mind, and it made him question everything. As the tension thickened around them, the question remained: what would happen when the fight was over? Would Vince still be the man he thought he was? Or would Trump's quiet challenge change everything? The answer was still to come, and it loomed over them like a storm ready to break. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Vince's heart pounded in his chest, and every breath felt like a struggle against the pressure that had been building all evening. His mind was torn between the fierce pride that had guided him through years of leading his gang and the strange, gnawing doubt that Trump had planted in his mind. It wasn't just the physical fight anymore. It was something deeper, something more personal. And that was what scared him the most. The bikers stood in a loose circle, watching, waiting for their leader to make a decision. Some of them were looking to Vince for direction, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Others, like Razor, were looking for a way out, a sign that it was time to leave before things got worse. The atmosphere felt fragile, like a wire stretched tight, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Trump's presence was like a constant pull, drawing everyone's attention back to him. His calmness was infuriating. Every time Vince thought about charging forward, about showing Trump who was in control, Trump's steady gaze seemed to hold him in place. There was no arrogance, no mocking smile, just a quiet confidence that made Vince feel small and uncertain in a way he wasn't used to. Finally, Vince spoke, his voice rough and tinged with anger. "I'm not going anywhere. You came here to challenge me, and I'm not running from it. If you want to fight, you're gonna get one." Trump didn't flinch. "I'm not here to fight, Vince. I'm here to offer you a choice. But if you want to keep going down this road, I'll follow you." Vince could feel the gang's eyes on him, the weight of their expectations pressing down on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his crew, for the life they had built together. This wasn't just about a challenge. It was about everything they stood for, everything that defined them. And if he backed down now, if he admitted that Trump might be right, it would all be over. Trump took a step closer, his voice steady. "I don't need to prove anything to you, Vince. I've already won. All I'm asking is that you stop and think about the bigger picture. You've got more than this. You've got a chance to change things, to make something better. But you have to let go of the old ways. You have to let go of the anger." Vince's fists clenched tighter, the tension in his body nearly unbearable. The thought of walking away, of leaving behind the life he had known for so long, filled him with a cold, deep dread. What would he have left? What would any of them have left? The gang was his family, the only family he had ever known. And to turn his back on it, to let someone like Trump take it all away, felt like an impossible choice. "You don't understand," Vince growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can come in here and lecture me? You think you can just waltz in and change everything? This is the way it is. This is the way it's always been." But even as he said the words, Vince felt something inside him shift. The anger that had been his constant companion, the driving force behind every decision, every fight, seemed to lose some of its power. He had built his entire life on this anger, on proving himself to the world, but now, in the face of Trump's quiet conviction, it felt less solid, less real. Behind him, Razor spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Vince, I don't know what's going on with you, but I can't keep doing this. This isn't the life I signed up for. I didn't think it would come to this. Vince shot him a glare, but the doubt that had been creeping into his mind now seemed impossible to ignore. He could feel his resolve beginning to crack, the foundations of his world shifting in ways he couldn't control. What had been a fight for dominance was now a battle for his soul, and the stakes had never felt higher. Trump watched him silently, as if waiting for Vince to make up his mind. There was no rush, no urgency in Trump's movements. He knew he had all the time in the world. The question wasn't about who could throw the hardest punch. It was about who was willing to face the truth. "You've got nothing left to prove," Trump said softly, his words cutting through the tension. "The world will keep spinning whether you fight or not. The only thing that matters is what you do next. You can walk away from this, Vince. You can let go of the past and choose something better. But that's up to you." Vince's head spun. It felt like the ground was slipping away from under him. He had always been in control. He had always been the one to dictate the rules, to carve his own path. But now, in the face of Trump's calm resolve, he wasn't sure what that path was anymore. Maybe he was ready for something different, something that didn't involve constantly fighting, constantly proving himself. Maybe it was time to let go of the anger that had defined him for so long. But that wasn't easy. It was one thing to say it, to entertain the thought of a new life. It was another to take that first step, to walk away from everything he had known, everything he had built. The gang, the lifestyle, the power. It was all at risk, and he wasn't sure if he was willing to throw it all away. The silence stretched on, unbearable, suffocating. Vince's heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, their hopes and doubts weighing down on him. Razor was waiting for him to make the call. And Trump, standing across from him, was waiting too, his eyes steady and unwavering. "Make your move," Trump said quietly, almost as a challenge. Vince's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it felt like time itself was suspended. The decision was his. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, every thought and feeling swirling in his mind. The anger, the fear, the pride, the doubt, all of it battling for control. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, something unexpected happened. A loud roar of engines cut through the stillness, and the ground beneath them vibrated as a fresh group of bikers tore into the lot, skidding to a halt in front of the gang. Their arrival shattered the fragile tension that had been building. They were here, and they weren't alone. The battle was far from over, and Vince's decision had just become a lot more complicated. The roar of the engines was deafening, drowning out everything else in an instant. Vince's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing as the new bikers screeched to a halt in front of the lot, their motorcycles kicking up gravel and dust in a cloud. The fresh group wasn't like the others. This wasn't just a few stragglers looking for trouble. These were seasoned riders, hardened by years of battle, their leather jackets adorned with patches that told stories of their own. They weren't here to join the fight. They were here to take control. Vince felt the familiar fire in his gut ignite once more, but this time it was different. The sudden intrusion threw off his rhythm, shattering the fragile moment of hesitation he had been holding on to. His mind raced, scrambling to make sense of the situation. The newcomers didn't belong here, and yet they were here, taking over the space with the same confidence he had once carried. But now the space felt different, more crowded, more dangerous. The new bikers didn't waste time. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cold, steely glare, dismounted from his bike and took slow, purposeful steps toward the group. His eyes immediately locked onto Vince, a silent challenge in his gaze. The man's presence alone seemed to suck the air out of the parking lot, his aura radiating a sense of authority that Vince hadn't expected. Behind him, the other bikers fanned out, surrounding the lot like a pack of wolves ready to close in on their prey. Trump remained still, his eyes flicking briefly toward the newcomers before returning to Vince. He had a certain calmness about him now, as though this unexpected development had been anticipated. It was clear that he wasn't fazed by the new arrival, but Vince had no idea how to handle this curveball. His instincts were screaming at him to react, to fight, to show these intruders that this was still his territory. But the way they moved, smooth, deliberate, as if they had done this 1,000 times before, told Vince everything he needed to know. These weren't just bikers. These were people with a different agenda, people who understood power in ways that Vince hadn't yet figured out. The tall man who had approached stopped just a few feet away from Vince, his eyes scanning the group as if assessing each member. He didn't speak at first, the tension hanging thick in the air. And then, with a casual air that somehow made the situation more dangerous, he spoke. "I hear there's a bit of a party going on here," he said, his voice low, but carrying a weight that made every word feel like a threat. "Thought we'd come join." Vince's eyes narrowed. "This is our turf. You're not welcome here." The tall man chuckled, the sound hollow, as if he had heard this all before. "You don't seem to understand. We didn't come here to ask for permission. We came to take over." Vince's heart pounded. His gang's reputation had always been built on fear and respect, but these newcomers didn't seem to care about that. They were challenging not just his authority, but the very way he had always seen the world. The confidence they exuded was unlike anything Vince had ever faced before. These weren't just rival bikers, they were a different breed entirely. Behind him, Razor shifted uncomfortably, his voice barely audible. "Vince, this is bad. We need to back off. This is bigger than us." But Vince didn't answer. His focus was entirely on the tall man in front of him, his mind scrambling for a plan, anything that could keep him from losing control of the situation. He had never been in a standoff like this before. His instincts were telling him that this wasn't just a fight over territory. This was something far bigger, something that could break everything apart. The gang, the life he had built, everything was at stake now. And the worst part, he wasn't sure if he was ready to fight for it anymore. Trump took a step forward, his presence slicing through the tension like a blade. He had been standing quietly on the sidelines, but now his eyes locked onto the tall man, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "This isn't your fight. Stay out of it." The tall man's gaze flicked toward Trump for a split second before he smirked, the arrogance clear in his eyes. "Who's this? Some rich guy who thinks he can tell us what to do." Trump didn't flinch. His stance remained unbroken. "No, I'm someone who's seen enough to know that this game you're playing is a losing one." For the first time since his arrival, the tall man's expression faltered, just for a moment. But then, like a switch had been flipped, the smirk returned, and he looked back at Vince. "You've got a choice now, Vince. You can keep this charade going, fight for a few scraps of power, or you can make a real move. The choice is yours." Vince's mind was a storm of confusion and doubt. He had always been in control, always. But here in this moment, he realized he had no idea what was happening. He wasn't sure who these people were or what they wanted, but they were throwing his world into chaos. And Trump was the one who had started it all, pushing him to question everything he had believed. The tall man seemed to sense Vince's hesitation. His smile widened. "You know what they say, Vince. You either adapt or you get left behind. And trust me, there's no room for the weak in this world." The words hung in the air, biting into Vince's soul like a poison. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. This was a challenge to everything he had built, everything he had stood for. The gang, the power, his reputation, all of it was hanging by a thread. The newcomers began to close in, their movements synchronized, their eyes watching Vince like predators waiting for their moment to strike. Razor's voice was urgent now, barely a whisper. "We can't do this. We're outnumbered, Vince. You need to think fast." Vince's head snapped toward his second in command, his stomach churning. He had always been the one to make the decisions, the one to lead them through every battle, every confrontation. But now, for the first time, he felt lost. The power he had once commanded seemed fragile in the face of this new threat. And the worst part, he couldn't tell if he was more afraid of losing his gang or losing the fight inside himself. Trump stood still, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos around them. He wasn't offering an answer. He wasn't taking sides. He was just watching, waiting, as if the outcome of this standoff didn't concern him. But Vince wasn't sure anymore. Trump had set this in motion, had forced him to face himself in ways he wasn't ready to confront. And now the stakes were higher than ever. The question loomed large: who would walk away from this, and who would be left behind? The tension in the air was unbearable, every second feeling like an eternity. Vince could feel his heart thundering in his chest as he stood there, frozen in a battle between instinct and thought. The newcomers were closing in, their eyes filled with expectation, their every movement calculated. The weight of their challenge hung like a shadow over him, threatening to suffocate the very identity he had fought so hard to maintain. He looked around at his gang, his family, but their eyes were filled with uncertainty now, uncertainty that mirrored his own. Razor's voice cut through the silence again, urgent, pleading. "Vince, we can't fight them. They're not like the others. You've got to make a choice." But the choice wasn't as clear as it once had been. It wasn't just about taking down an enemy or proving himself anymore. It was about everything that had led him to this moment. The anger, the power, the pride that had shaped him for so long. And now, standing in the face of these newcomers, the ground beneath him felt like it was slipping away. Trump remained calm, his eyes flicking between the newcomers and Vince, as if waiting for him to make the final move. He wasn't offering any words of wisdom now, no last-minute advice. He was just there, like a constant reminder that the world Vince had created was built on something that no longer made sense. The question wasn't about winning or losing, it was about transformation. For the first time, Vince felt the full weight of Trump's words hit him. "You can keep going down this path," Trump had said earlier. "But it's a dead end." And in this moment, Vince realized Trump wasn't talking about a fight. He wasn't talking about power or territory. He was talking about a future that Vince had never considered. A future that didn't require violence, anger, or fear. But to accept it, Vince would have to break everything he had ever known. Just as the silence reached its breaking point, the tall man from the new gang stepped forward, his eyes cold and unblinking. "You've made your decision, Vince," he said, his voice low, laced with a promise of what would come if Vince chose to keep fighting. Vince's fists clenched tighter, his mind swirling with the weight of the moment. But something inside him shifted, something that had been growing ever since Trump had first challenged him. The old ways weren't the answer. They never had been. The anger that had driven him for so long, he didn't need it anymore. "I'm done," Vince said, his voice steady, though every word felt like it was tearing through him. The gang members around him seemed to freeze, some of them in disbelief, others in confusion. But the decision had been made. Vince had chosen a different path. The tall man's eyes narrowed, as if expecting a different answer. But Vince didn't flinch. He was done living in fear, done holding on to a past that no longer served him. The gang, the fight, the constant need for dominance, it was over. "You're making a mistake," the tall man said, his voice dark with menace. "You don't get to walk away from this." Vince turned away from him, looking around at his crew. Razor's eyes met his, filled with an understanding that spoke volumes. The others, still uncertain, looked to him for direction, but this time, Vince didn't have to give them any. They could follow him or walk away. It was their choice, just as it had been his. Trump's voice cut through the tension. "You made the right choice, Vince. Now it's time to leave." Just as Vince started to walk away, ready to leave the chaos behind, the unexpected twist hit. A loud, sharp noise split the air, a gunshot. Vince spun around, his heart racing, to see the tall man with the steely gaze holding a gun, pointing it directly at him. The world seemed to slow down. The gun was aimed at Vince's chest, the danger clear and immediate. The tall man's grin widened, his eyes glinting with triumph. "You thought you could just walk away." He sneered. "Nobody walks away from this." Everything happened in an instant. Trump moved with a speed Vince hadn't seen coming. Without hesitation, Trump was on the tall man, disarming him in a blur of motion that left the crowd stunned. Vince barely had time to react as Trump pushed the tall man to the ground, the gun falling harmlessly to the side. The new gang members stepped forward, but Trump was already standing over their leader, his eyes cold and unyielding. "This isn't your fight anymore," Trump said, his voice calm, but with a dangerous edge. "You'll leave, and you'll take your people with you." The tall man groaned, the wind knocked out of him, but he slowly pushed himself up, fury flashing in his eyes. He looked around at his crew, who seemed to hesitate for the first time. There was a moment of silence, the air thick with tension. And then, with a final venomous glare at Vince, the tall man turned away. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice a low growl. And just like that, the standoff was over. The new bikers, once so sure of their dominance, retreated, disappearing into the night without another word. The lot, once filled with the threat of violence and uncertainty, was now eerily quiet. Vince stood there, his heart still racing, his mind reeling from what had just transpired. Trump turned toward him, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did good, Vince. You made the right call." Vince stared at him, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "I didn't know it would end like this." "You didn't have to know," Trump replied, his voice calm. "Sometimes the right choice isn't the one you expect, but it's the one that changes everything." Vince didn't respond immediately. He glanced back at his gang, still unsure of where they stood. Some of them were looking at him with a new sense of respect, while others still seemed uncertain. The air was thick with the aftermath of everything that had happened. But one thing was clear, the world had changed. Vince had made a decision that had altered the course of his life and his gang's future. Whether they followed him into the unknown or stayed behind in the past was up to them. But for Vince, the past no longer had a hold on him. And then, just as Vince turned to walk away with Trump, a new voice cut through the silence. "Vince." It was Razor calling after him. He was standing near his bike, his face unreadable. Vince paused, his heart sinking in his chest. Razor had been with him through it all, but now he wasn't sure if this was the end of the road for them. "What is it?" Razor took a deep breath before speaking, his eyes steady. "I'm with you. We're with you." Vince's heart swelled with relief, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be more challenges, more decisions to make. But for the first time, Vince was ready to face it, with his crew, with Trump, and with a newfound sense of purpose. As they walked away from the lot, the tension that had defined them for so long finally began to fade. The world was uncertain, but for the first time, Vince felt like he had the strength to shape his own future. The night had fallen into a deep stillness as Vince and his gang made their way down the street, the engine hums of their motorcycles filling the void left by the chaos that had just unfolded. The air felt lighter now, like the storm had passed, though the tension still lingered in the corners of Vince's mind. As they moved farther from the lot, a sense of relief settled over him, though his thoughts kept racing. He had faced a crossroads, one that had threatened to break him, but he had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and perhaps even more at peace than he had been in years. Trump rode alongside him, silent for the most part, his gaze fixed ahead. It was hard to tell what was going through the man's mind, but for the first time, Vince felt like he understood him a little more. Trump wasn't the kind of guy who needed to speak often. His actions spoke for him. And in the way he had handled the standoff, Vince saw a level of control and wisdom that he had never considered before. Trump had never needed to fight. He had simply been confident enough to let the situation unfold without letting emotions cloud his judgment. It was a skill Vince was still learning. Razor rode beside him, his face a mixture of relief and contemplation. Vince could tell that his second-in-command was processing everything in his own way. Razor had always been the more level-headed one, the one who made sure their gang ran smoothly. But tonight had been different. It wasn't just about making decisions. It was about changing the course of their lives. The tension between them had lifted, but it hadn't gone unnoticed. There was a new understanding between them, an unspoken bond forged in the heat of the moment. Razor was with him, through the fight, through the doubts, through the unknown. As they reached a quieter stretch of road, Vince slowed down and pulled off to the side. The others followed suit, coming to a stop behind him. The group gathered around, a sense of camaraderie settling over them like a cloak. They weren't just riders anymore. They were a family, one that had been through the fire and come out on the other side with a new sense of purpose. "I know this hasn't been easy," Vince began, his voice quiet but steady. "We've been through hell, and a lot of you probably wonder where we go from here." Razor spoke up first, his voice firm but with a hint of something new. "You made the right choice, Vince. We're with you." Vince looked at his gang, his heart swelling with pride. They had come this far together. He had feared that they would scatter after the confrontation, that the division between them would grow too wide. But instead, they were more united than ever. There was a bond now, stronger than the old ties of fear and dominance. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about loyalty, trust, and understanding. And in that moment, Vince realized just how much he had grown. He had stopped fighting for control and started fighting for the people who mattered. "I don't know what the future holds," Vince continued, looking around at his crew. "But I know one thing. We'll face it together. No more living in the past. We've got a new path ahead of us." Trump, who had been silently observing the group, nodded in approval. "That's the right attitude. The past can weigh you down, or you can use it to fuel the future. But it's your choice." Vince turned to look at him. "You've been a big part of this. I don't think I would have made it out of this situation without you." Trump's smile was small but genuine. "I'm just here to help people see things differently. It's up to them to do the work." Vince knew there was truth in that. Trump hadn't given him the answers, but he had shown him how to find them. The decisions had always been Vince's, but the clarity had come from within himself, something Trump had gently nudged him to discover. It was a humbling realization, one that made Vince feel more grounded than he had in a long time. The night was quiet now, but the weight of the day's events still hung heavy in the air. There was a lot to rebuild, a lot to sort through, but for the first time in a long while, Vince felt hopeful. The old ways of living had drained him. But now, with a clearer purpose, he could see a future, one that didn't involve constant conflict, but something far more fulfilling. The gang wasn't just a group of people who followed him because they feared him. They were his brothers and sisters, and it was up to him to lead them into a new era. As they revved their engines and prepared to hit the road again, Vince caught a glimpse of the city skyline in the distance. It was a symbol of everything that had come before: the chaos, the uncertainty, the violence. But now, as he looked at it, he saw a new horizon. A horizon filled with possibilities, not just for himself, but for everyone in his crew. For the first time, Vince knew that he wasn't just a biker. He wasn't just a gang leader. He was someone who had the power to change his own fate. And that was more than he had ever imagined. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be bumps along the way, moments of doubt, and even setbacks. But now, Vince felt ready. Ready to leave behind the shadows of his past and step into something better. The road was still long, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had learned to look beyond the battles and see the bigger picture, the one that could lead them all to something more meaningful. As the night stretched on, the group rode into the distance, the sound of their motorcycles blending into the rhythm of the world around them. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about the freedom they had earned, the freedom to choose their own path. And as they rode, one thing was clear. The road ahead, with all its twists and turns, would be theirs to travel together. And so, as the sun began to rise on a new day, Vince knew that whatever came next, they would face it as a family, stronger, wiser, and united by something far more powerful than fear. And that, in the end, was the victory that truly mattered.